Imagine this: a billionaire with everything money can buy, except peace of mind. A small-town mechanic who fixes engines with nothing but her hands and her heart. When their worlds collide over a broken car, secrets buried in the past roar back to life. What begins as a challenge turns into a journey of freedom. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about cars. It's about the people who make them sing. And trust me, you won't want to miss how Let's dive into the tale of Robert Mitchell and Sarah Barnes. A love story fueled by pride, passion, and the sound of engines with soul. The Chevelle's engine gave one final cough before falling silent, leaving Robert Mitchell stranded on the side of a quiet Brentwood street. The car, a 1970s Chevelle SS in pristine blue, had been his pride since he restored it years ago. It was more than a car. It was a family heirloom, a roaring piece of history passed from father to son. But now it sat lifeless under the gray Tennessee sky. Robert gripped the steering wheel, suppressing a curse. This was the 8th time in 2 months. He had taken it to every high-end shop in Nashville, consulted engineers, even flown in a specialist once. Each time, they sent the car back with vague answers and hefty bills. None had fixed the problem. And today, of all days, it had chosen to die right in front of a garage so small and worn down it barely looked open. The sign read, Barnes & Sons Auto Repair. But the paint was faded, some letters peeling. Tires stacked outside were coated with dust, and the building's corrugated roof had visible patches of rust. Robert raised an eyebrow. This was where engines came to die, not be resurrected. He sighed, stepping out of the car in his tailored suit. The contrast between him and the garage was almost comical. His polished Italian shoes crunched on gravel as he approached the entrance. A faint smell of motor oil and old metal greeted him, along with the sound of country music playing somewhere inside. At the back of the garage, someone was bent over an old truck, their figure half hidden under the hood. Dirty boots, greasy jeans. From a distance, Robert assumed it was an old man. But when the person stood upright, wiping their hands on a worn rag, he froze. She was young, not the type of young that was delicate or glamorous, but the kind that was toughened by years of work. Her hands were covered in grease, her ponytail messy, and her jeans stained from countless repairs. She looked ordinary, except for the spark in her eyes, sharp, confident, almost daring. Robert let a hint of sarcasm drip into his voice. "Is there anyone here who can fix a real classic?" The woman arched an eyebrow, wiping her hands slowly. "I'm the mechanic, Sarah Barnes. I can take a look at your car." Robert blinked. "Her? You?" he asked, his tone slipping into skepticism. "That's right," she replied, with a half-smile. "Miss Barnes, with all due respect, I've taken this car to 7 specialty shops. The best engineers in Nashville couldn't fix it." Sarah leaned casually against the truck bumper, crossing her arms. "That's because you didn't come here first." The boldness almost made Robert laugh. Almost. "If you fix this engine, I'll give you my entire salary," he said, smirking. Sarah's eyes gleamed with mischief. "All right," she said without hesitation, "but I want it in cash." Robert wasn't sure if she was serious, but the way she said it, calm, unwavering, hit his pride like a hammer. He had expected her to laugh or brush off his challenge. Instead, she just turned to a rusty cabinet, pulling out an old toolbox with E. Barnes handwritten on the lid. "Pop the hood," she said. Robert obeyed without thinking, curious to see how far she'd get before giving up. Sarah studied the engine with the intensity of a surgeon. She didn't rush. She didn't ask questions. Instead, she pulled a small piece of hose from her pocket, touched it to the engine block, and listened through the other end. Her brow furrowed, and Robert noticed how calm she was, how each movement had purpose. Within 10 minutes, she removed 2 parts, adjusted the ignition line manually, and scrubbed connectors with a short bristled brush. "Try it now," she said, stepping back. Robert slid into the driver's seat, half expecting disappointment. He turned the key, and the Chevelle roared to life, deep and steady, like the old days. The sound reverberated in his chest, pure and perfect. He cut the engine and stepped out. stunned. "How did you—" he stammered. Sarah shrugged, wiping her hands. "Reversed connection in the ignition system. Your engine was asking for help." Robert tried to regain composure. "How much do I owe you?" She didn't hesitate. "Your salary." He laughed, but the smile faded quickly when she stepped closer, her gaze sharp. "My dad used to say, a man's word is the word of a king, and a king doesn't go back on it. Are you a man, Mr. Mitchell?" Robert froze. Something about her tone, firm yet calm, made him uncomfortable. "I'll bring the money tomorrow," he said finally. "I'll be here," she replied, already turning back to the truck she'd been working on. Robert got in the Chevelle, which now purred like a satisfied lion, and drove away without looking back. But inside, his pride was in shambles. She hadn't tried to impress him, hadn't begged for his approval. She had simply done what no one else could, listened to the engine, and shattered his ego in the process. That night, Robert lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his luxurious house. His thoughts kept returning to the greasy mechanic who had outsmarted every specialist he knew. Her voice echoed in his head. "Are you a man, Mr. Mitchell?" By morning, he had made up his mind. At exactly 9 a.m., he would return to that dusty little shop in Brentwood, with the envelope full of cash and a burning question he couldn't yet name. The following morning, Robert Mitchell parked his Chevelle in front of Barnes & Sons Auto Repair at exactly 9 o'clock. The engine purred flawlessly, reminding him with every soft growl that it was a woman with oil-stained hands, not a high-paid engineer, who had brought it back to life. He stepped out of the car, his polished demeanor intact, though inside he felt strangely unsettled. In the inside pocket of his blazer rested a thick envelope, stuffed with cash. The amount stung his pride, but a deal was a deal. The garage looked the same as yesterday: peeling paint, crooked sign, and the faint smell of gasoline and metal. Sarah Barnes was bent over the hood of a faded blue Ford F-150, her plaid shirt tied around her waist and her hair pulled back in the same messy ponytail. She didn't even glance up when she heard his footsteps. "Good morning, Miss Barnes," Robert said, forcing a casual tone. Sarah finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Oh, you came back. I thought you might forget our conversation." A Mitchell never forgets a debt. He pulled the envelope from his pocket and handed it over. $15,000, just like I promised. Sarah took the envelope without hesitation, counted the money quickly, then gave a single nod. "Word of a king," she murmured, slipping it into a dusty drawer behind a stack of old manuals. Robert waited for some reaction: surprise, gratitude, maybe even admiration. But Sarah simply returned to tightening a bolt on the F-150 as if receiving $15,000 in cash was an everyday occurrence. That indifference gnawed at him. "You know," he said, crossing his arms, "most people would at least say thank you." Sarah smirked without looking at him. "Why would I thank you for keeping your word? You said you'd pay. And you did. That's not a favor. That's a deal." Her words hit harder than he expected. Robert opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when she spoke again. "Is there something else you need, Mr. Mitchell? Or do you just enjoy standing around garages in expensive suits?" Robert stiffened. "Actually, I do have something else." He paused, measuring his words. "I want to see if yesterday wasn't just luck." Sarah's wrench stopped mid-turn. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Luck? We've got an engine at my factory that's been giving us trouble for 3 weeks. A whole team of engineers hasn't been able to figure it out. Want to give it a shot?" Sarah dried her hands on a rag, tilting her head. "Why would I do that? Curiosity? Money?" Robert shrugged. "Take your pick." She stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. "If I fix that engine, you treat me with respect. No more condescending miss, no more side glances, no more testing whether I just got lucky." Robert hesitated. There was something in her voice, a quiet authority that made him feel like the one being tested. "Deal," he said, extending his hand. Sarah shook it firmly. Her grip was strong, rough from years of work, but steady. "Then let's go to your factory." Mitchell Automotive Industries stood on the other side of Brentwood, a gleaming industrial complex with glass buildings, polished floors, and spotless parking lots. Sarah's faded red pickup looked out of place among the luxury cars and company trucks. She stepped out, her eyes scanning the facility with interest, but no trace of intimidation. Robert, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of pride and nervousness. He led her to the development area, where 5 engineers in crisp white shirts stood around a V8 engine laid out on a metal workbench. "Everyone," Robert said, "this is Sarah Barnes. She's going to take a look at our problem." The engineers exchanged skeptical glances. One, a middle-aged man with glasses, frowned. "Is she a specialist consultant?" "She's a mechanic," Robert replied. The silence that followed was awkward. Sarah noticed their dismissive stares, but didn't flinch. She walked straight to the engine, her hands already itching to work. "What's the problem?" she asked. "The engine starts," said a blonde female engineer, "but it loses power after a few minutes. We checked injection, electrical system, cooling, everything looks normal in the tests." Sarah nodded, pulled a pen from her pocket, and began jotting numbers and diagrams on her left arm. The engineers watched her as if she were some rare animal. "Can I take the head off?" she asked. "Go ahead," Robert said. She got to work, her hands moving with deliberate precision. Within 15 minutes, she disassembled the head, examined each part, and pointed to a small sensor. "Here's your problem," she said. "Bad contact in the coolant temperature sensor. It's sending the wrong data to the ECU. The system thinks the engine is overheating and cuts power automatically." "That's not possible," the man with glasses muttered. "We tested that sensor 3 times." "You tested it outside the engine," Sarah replied calmly. "The problem only shows up with vibration. The internal contact is loose." She unplugged the sensor, cleaned the terminals, and reconnected everything. After reassembling the head, she stepped back. "Test it now." The man with glasses reluctantly started the engine. The V8 roared smoothly, holding a steady idle. He revved it, and the engine responded perfectly. The engineers fell silent. Robert looked at Sarah, genuinely impressed. "You're a genius," she smirked. "I prefer to be called a mechanic." With that, she returned the tools and headed for the exit. Robert followed, still processing what had just happened. "How did you know?" he asked as they walked down the hallway. Sarah didn't stop. "I listened to the engine. It told me where the problem was. Engines don't talk." She turned to him, her eyes sharp. "To those who know how to listen, they do." Then she walked out, leaving Robert standing with more questions than answers, and the certainty that Sarah Barnes was more than just a small-town mechanic. She was a mystery he had to unravel. Robert Mitchell barely slept that night. The image of Sarah Barnes dismantling an engine in 15 minutes while 5 expert engineers stood in silence played in his head like a stubborn memory. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still see her steady hands, the confidence in her movements, and the way she left without seeking validation. It wasn't just her skill that unsettled him. It was the way she made him feel small in his own world. For years, Robert had been the one who knew everything, the one who made the final call. But yesterday, he had felt like a student again, watching a teacher who didn't even know she was teaching. By morning, he sat behind his mahogany desk, staring at spreadsheets that suddenly felt meaningless. His father's portrait hung on the wall, a reminder of the empire he had inherited. Mitchell Automotive was a giant in the industry, yet a small-town mechanic had humbled them all. At 10 a.m., he buzzed his secretary through the intercom. "Jennifer, prepare an employment contract. Senior consulting engineer. Starting salary, $80,000 a year with 6-month reviews." "For which candidate, sir?" "I'll do the interview myself." He didn't elaborate further. That afternoon, Robert arrived at Barnes & Sons Auto Repair without his usual suit and tie. He wore a light blue dress shirt, sleeves rolled up, trying to seem less formal. The moment he stepped into the shop, he felt out of place among the smell of oil and the scattered tools. Sarah was under a black Dodge Ram, only her legs visible. The sound of a wrench echoed from beneath the truck. "Miss Barnes," he called, "if this is another test, "You can leave," came her voice, muffled. "I've already proven my point." Robert smiled despite himself. "Actually, I came to make an offer." Sarah slid out from under the truck, sitting on the floor and looking at him with a mix of curiosity and annoyance. She had a smudge of oil on her cheek and strands of hair falling from her ponytail. "What kind of offer?" she asked flatly. Robert took out the contract from his pocket and unfolded it. "A job at Mitchell Automotive Industries. 80,000 a year, plus benefits. You'd be our senior consulting engineer." Sarah glanced at the paper, scanned it quickly, and handed it back without hesitation. "No, thank you." Robert blinked. He had prepared for negotiation, not outright rejection. "You didn't even think about it." 80,000 is 4 times more than I make here," she said, wiping her hands. "So what? I'm fine where I am. This is my place." "Your father's shop?" Robert asked, looking around. "Where is he?" Sarah pointed to a framed photo on the wall. A smiling man in a blue jumpsuit held a wrench in his hand. Below the picture was a small plaque, "In memory of Edward Barnes, 1965-2021. A knot formed in Robert's stomach. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "It's okay," Sarah said softly. "He taught me everything I know. This shop is his legacy, and I'm not leaving it behind." Robert tried again. "But Sarah, think about it. You work with old tools. The floor is cracked. The roof leaks. You have too much talent to stay here." She turned to him, her expression firm. "Do you know the difference between an engine and a machine, Mr. Mitchell?" Robert hesitated. "An engine is a type of machine." "No," she interrupted. "An engine has a story. Every scratch, every strange sound tells where it's been, who drove it, what it's been through. Machines in your factory are just numbers. No soul, no story." She gestured to the Dodge. "This one belonged to Jim Morrison. He drove his daughter to school every day in it. 17 years later, she's a doctor. He still brings it in every month because this engine holds their memories." Robert stayed silent, strangely moved. "That's why I'm here," she continued. "Engines with soul. At your company, you just have machines." "That's romantic," Robert said, trying to sound amused. "But it doesn't build a future." Sarah shot him a look that made him stop talking. "My father built this place with his hands. He raised me with these tools. He taught me engines can sing, if you know how to listen." Robert wanted to argue, but something about her conviction silenced him. He looked at the toolbox beside her, the wooden handles worn smooth by years of work. One wrench had a blue-painted handle. "Was this his?" he asked. "Some were his. That one I made myself when I was 15. My dad said a real mechanic has to know their tools like a musician knows their instrument." Robert handed it back carefully. "You made this? It's perfect." Sarah shrugged. "It's not about perfect. It's about knowing how it feels in your hand." Robert studied her for a moment. "Sarah, imagine what you could do with unlimited resources. Research, cutting-edge technology." "For what?" she interrupted again. "To build more machines? To forget where engines come from?" She picked up a screwdriver and returned to the Dodge. "I fixed your Chevelle because I listened to it. At your factory, no one listens." Robert opened his mouth to protest but realized she was right. When was the last time he had touched an engine with his own hands? 15 years? Longer? He had forgotten what it felt like. "Sarah," he said softly, "aren't you afraid of being left behind?" She slid out again and looked at him directly. "Mr. Mitchell, you may have labs and fancy equipment, but I have something money can't buy." "What's that?" "I know how to make an engine sing." She started the Dodge. The engine's growl was perfect, smooth, alive. "That's music," she said, shutting it off. "That's soul." Robert stood there, listening to the silence after the engine stopped. For the first time in years, he realized he hadn't just heard noise. He had truly listened. Sarah turned back to her work, making it clear the conversation was over. "Your offer is tempting, Mr. Mitchell, but I'd rather stay here, where engines can be themselves." Robert left the shop with the unsigned contract in his pocket and the sound of that Dodge's engine echoing in his mind. He had never been turned down so easily, and he had never wanted to come back so badly. Robert Mitchell returned to the office later than usual. His employees noticed the difference immediately. He wasn't barking orders or briskly moving from one meeting to another. Instead, he walked with a distracted air, his mind far from spreadsheets and contracts. For the rest of the day, he barely touched his work. Every few minutes, his thoughts drifted back to Sarah Barnes, the way she had dismissed his generous offer, her unwavering confidence, and her words about engines having stories. That night, Robert sat in his living room, staring at the envelope that had once contained $15,000. He thought about the expression on Sarah's face when she took it, calm, unfazed, as if the money meant nothing. Most people would have been overjoyed. She had treated it like loose change. For a man who measured success in numbers, that shook him more than he wanted to admit. The next morning, Robert found himself driving back to Barnes & Sons Auto Repair without any real excuse. He told himself he just wanted to check if the Chevelle was still running perfectly. Deep down, he knew that wasn't the reason. The shop looked the same as always: peeling sign, worn walls, and the comforting smell of oil and gasoline. Inside, Sarah was bent over the hood of an old Ford Ranger. Her hands moved quickly, her focus absolute. She didn't even glance at him when he stepped in. "You came back," she said, without looking up. Robert smirked. "You sound surprised." "I'm not. People like you always come back. You're curious." She tightened a bolt, wiped her hands on a rag, and finally met his eyes. "So, Mr. Mitchell, what's the excuse this time?" "I don't need an excuse to visit a good mechanic," he replied. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Flattery doesn't work here." Robert chuckled, then leaned casually against the workbench. "I was thinking, maybe yesterday wasn't just about an engine. Maybe it was about respect." Sarah crossed her arms, skeptical. "And you think you've paid that debt with cash?" "No," Robert admitted. "That was just money. Respect isn't bought. It's earned." Sarah tilted her head slightly, as if weighing his words. "So why are you here?" "I want to understand," he said honestly. "You fixed something no one else could. You refused an offer most people would kill for. You talk about engines like they're alive. I want to know why." Sarah gave a small, humorless laugh. "You're asking why I don't sell my soul to your company?" Robert didn't answer right away. He was learning that Sarah had a way of turning questions back on him. Instead, he asked, "Why does this place matter so much to you?" She gestured around the garage. "My father built this shop with his hands. Every scratch on these walls tells a story. Every tool here has been used 1,000 times. When I fix an engine, I'm not just fixing metal. I'm fixing memories." Robert was silent, absorbing her words. Sarah picked up a wrench and continued, her tone softer. "You know why I fixed your Chevelle so quickly? Not because I'm a genius. Because I listened. That car wasn't just broken. It was crying out. You didn't hear it because you've forgotten how to listen." The word stung, but Robert couldn't deny the truth. He hadn't truly listened to an engine, or a person, in years. "You think I've forgotten?" he asked quietly. Sarah looked at him, her eyes sharp, yet not unkind. "I know you have. People who sit in glass offices forget what real work feels like. They forget the smell of oil, the heat of metal, the sound of an engine's heartbeat. You've been away from it too long." Robert took a step closer. "Then teach me." Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "Teach you?" "Yes. Teach me how to listen again." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read his soul. Then, to his surprise, she smiled faintly. "Be careful what you ask for, Mr. Mitchell. This isn't boardroom work. You'll get dirty, you'll sweat, you'll bleed." "I'm not afraid of that." "Good," she said, "because respect isn't just earned, it's built, one bolt at a time." The rest of the morning, Robert stayed in the shop, watching Sarah work. He handed her tools when she asked, listened to her explanations, and tried to follow her instructions. His expensive shirt soon bore smudges of grease, and his hands, once perfectly clean, were blackened. At one point, he dropped a wrench, and Sarah smirked. "For an engineer, you're pretty bad with your hands." "It's been a while," Robert admitted. "Then stop thinking so much and start feeling. Engines don't care about your calculations. They care if you listen." For the first time in years, Robert felt like he was learning something real, and he liked it. As he was leaving, Sarah called after him. "Mr. Mitchell?" He turned. "Yes?" She wiped her hands and gave him a rare, almost teasing smile. "Come back tomorrow. Bring clothes you don't mind ruining." Robert couldn't help but grin. "I'll be here." That night, Robert stared at his grease-stained hands with a strange sense of pride. For years he had measured his worth by clean suits and signed deals. But today he had earned something far more valuable: the first brick in a bridge of respect. The next day dawned with a golden Tennessee sunrise, and Robert Mitchell was already behind the wheel of his Chevelle, driving toward Barnes & Sons Auto Repair. Unlike his usual crisp suits, today he wore faded jeans, an old t-shirt, and sneakers that hadn't seen daylight in years. The decision felt strange, almost rebellious, but it suited where he was going. When he arrived, Sarah was already there, as he expected. She always seemed to arrive before the day began, as if she belonged to the shop the way the smell of gasoline did. She was wiping down tools, each one neatly placed on the bench, with the kind of care only someone who truly respected their craft would give. She glanced at him briefly. "You're early." "You said to bring clothes I don't mind ruining," Robert replied, holding out his arms. "How do I look?" Sarah's lips twitched into a half smile. "Like a man who's about to regret his life choices," Robert chuckled. "We'll see." Sarah pointed toward an old 1965 Mustang, its parts scattered across a tarp on the floor. "This," she said, "is your test." Robert crouched down, eyeing the parts. "Whose is it?" "Mine now," Sarah said. "The owner gave up on fixing it. I bought it cheap. If you're serious about learning, we're going to rebuild this engine together." Robert raised an eyebrow. "From scratch?" "From worse than scratch," Sarah corrected. "This engine's been neglected for years. It'll fight you at every turn." "I like a challenge," Sarah smirked. "Good. Then let's start." She guided him step by step, showing how to check surfaces for damage, how to clean the parts, and how to apply the right amount of sealant. Robert followed her instructions carefully, but it was harder than he expected. He dropped bolts, applied too much sealant, and struggled to fit parts correctly. "You're overthinking it," Sarah said, watching him struggle with a gasket. "Stop calculating like an engineer. Feel it. The engine will tell you when it's right." Robert frowned, but obeyed. This time, instead of forcing the part, he let his hands guide him. It clicked into place perfectly. "Better," Sarah said. As the hours passed, Robert's movements became less clumsy. Sweat dripped down his forehead. His hands grew sore, but he felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. Sarah corrected him when necessary, never sugarcoating her feedback. "Again," she said when he installed a valve improperly. "But it's almost doesn't count. Do it again." Robert redid it. This time, it was perfect. By midday, Chewie arrived, carrying a small lunchbox. The boy's face lit up when he saw Robert working with greasy hands. "Whoa," Chewie said wide-eyed. "The suit guy's really doing it." Robert laughed. "Mr. Mitchell, to you." Chewie grinned. "Not with those hands? You're one of us now?" Sarah chuckled, shaking her head. "Don't encourage him." Chewie sat nearby, watching closely as they worked. "You know, Sarah's the best mechanic in Tennessee," he said proudly. Robert glanced at Sarah. "I'm starting to believe that." Sarah ignored the compliment, focusing on tightening a bolt. But Robert noticed the faintest hint of color in her cheeks. Later that afternoon, after hours of work, Sarah wiped her hands and turned to Robert. "You've proven you can follow instructions. Now, let's see if you can think." Robert raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" "I want you to take what you've learned here and apply it to your factory." She leaned against the bench. "You told me about that engine your engineers couldn't fix. Bring me another one, a real challenge. I'll fix it, and I want you to watch closely this time." Robert hesitated. "You want to go back to the factory?" "No," Sarah said. "I want the engine brought here. Let's see if your fancy equipment is really better than a garage floor." Robert smirked. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. Bring me that engine. I'll show you how to make it sing." Robert stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "You've got a deal." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Robert packed up to leave. His arms ached, his back throbbed, and his hands were covered in oil. Yet he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time in years, he had built something real. As he was leaving, Sarah called out, "Hey, Mr. Mitchell." He turned. "Yeah?" "You're not completely hopeless." She smirked. "Just mostly." Robert laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." Sarah gave him a faint smile, the kind that hinted at something more than annoyance. "Don't make me regret teaching you." "You won't," he said softly. When he drove away, the Mustang's unfinished engine still sat on the tarp. But in his chest, something had already started to hum, like an engine beginning to wake. The following morning, Robert arrived at the shop before sunrise. The streets of Brentwood were still quiet, bathed in the pale orange glow of dawn. For the first time in years, he felt the excitement of anticipation, an eagerness to work not in a boardroom, but on a cold, oil-stained floor. Sarah was already there, of course. She stood by the open garage door with a coffee cup in hand, watching him pull in. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes gave away a trace of amusement. "You're early," she said, sipping her coffee. Robert grinned, trying to impress the teacher. Sarah smirked. "Don't try to impress me, Mr. Mitchell. Just try not to break anything today." They went back to the Mustang engine. Robert rolled up his sleeves without hesitation, and Sarah handed him a rag. "Lesson of the day," she said, "is listening, not with your ears. Well, not just your ears, with everything. Your hands, your eyes, even your instincts." Robert nodded, curious. "I'm listening." Sarah crouched beside the engine, placing her hand lightly on the block, as if feeling for a pulse. "Engines talk. Every vibration, every hiss, every knock tells a story. Most mechanics rush to fix what they think is the problem. I wait until I know what the engine is actually saying." Robert watched closely as she demonstrated, turning the crankshaft slowly, tilting her head to catch faint noises. "You hear that?" she asked. "I hear something," Robert admitted. "A faint click?" "Exactly." Sarah's eyes lit up. "That click tells me there's a loose connection inside the valve train. A rookie would ignore it, but if you don't fix it now, it'll cause hell later." Robert leaned closer, genuinely impressed. "You make it sound alive." "It is alive," Sarah said firmly. "Every engine has a soul. Treat it like a machine, and it'll fail you. Treat it like something that breathes, and it'll sing for you." He studied her as she worked. The way she moved, fluid yet precise, was like watching a musician play an instrument. There was no arrogance, just confidence born from years of experience. "You really believe that?" he said softly. Sarah glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I don't just believe it, I know it." As the morning wore on, Robert attempted to mirror her approach. He tried to feel the parts rather than just assemble them, to listen instead of calculate. But old habits were hard to break. "You're forcing it again," Sarah said, when he tightened a bolt too hard. "It needs to be secure." "It needs to be balanced," she corrected. "If you over-tighten, you'll strip the thread. Feel it. Let your hand tell you when it's enough." Robert took a deep breath, trying again. This time, he stopped at the subtle resistance Sarah had described. She nodded approvingly. "Better." For a brief moment, he felt like a student earning his teacher's praise. And strangely, he liked it. Around noon, Chewy burst through the shop door, carrying his backpack and grinning from ear to ear. "Hey, Sarah. Hey, Mr. Mitchell." Robert waved. "Hello, Chewy." The boy's eyes widened when he saw Robert's hands covered in grease. "Whoa, you're actually working? Sarah, he's working." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Yes, he's working. Don't make a big deal out of it." Chewy hopped onto a stool, watching them closely. "Sarah, did you teach him how to talk to engines yet?" Robert chuckled. "She's trying." "She's the best," Chewy said proudly. "Engines listen to her. She even fixed the orphanage's generator when nobody else could." Robert's curiosity piqued. "You live at the orphanage, Chewy?" The boy nodded without hesitation. "My parents died in a car crash when I was 8. Sarah lets me hang around here after school. Teaches me stuff. Says one day, I'll be a great mechanic." Robert felt something tighten in his chest. Sarah, without looking up, said quietly, "He's already better than most rookies I've met." Chewy beamed at the praise, then turned to Robert. "And you, Mr. Mitchell? You gonna learn to talk to engines?" "I'm trying," Robert said honestly. "You better try hard," the boy teased. "Engines don't like liars," Sarah smirked. After Chewie left to finish his homework, Robert and Sarah continued working in companionable silence. The radio played softly in the background, an old Johnny Cash song filling the air. Robert found himself glancing at Sarah more often than he should. There was something captivating about her, not just her skill, but her strength, the quiet resilience in the way she carried herself. She didn't need anyone's approval, least of all his, and that made him respect her even more. At one point, she caught him staring. "What?" "Nothing," Robert said quickly. "Just, you make this look easy," Sarah smirked. "It's not easy. It's just what I love." As the day drew to a close, Sarah leaned against the workbench, wiping her hands. "You know, Mr. Mitchell, you keep asking why I won't leave this shop, why I won't take your job. You still don't get it." "Then explain it to me," Robert said, genuinely curious. Sarah pointed to the walls, the tools, the half-assembled engines. "This place isn't just where I work. It's where I live. Every car that comes through here has a story. I fix them, and in return, they keep those stories alive. At your company, engines are just numbers. Here, they have soul." Robert nodded slowly, finally starting to understand. "Maybe I need to learn how to see engines the way you do." Sarah's gaze softened, just slightly. "Maybe you do." As Robert drove away that evening, the Chevelle's purr felt different to him. It wasn't just an engine running smoothly. It was a song, one he had never truly listened to until now. And somewhere deep down, he realized Sarah Barnes wasn't just teaching him about engines. She was teaching him how to live. Robert Mitchell spent the next several days working alongside Sarah in the small garage. Each morning, he left behind the glass walls of his corporate office to get his hands dirty, and each evening he drove home with the smell of oil on his clothes and the sound of engines humming in his mind. He didn't understand why, but he felt more alive in that rundown shop than in all the years he had spent building his empire. Yet, amid the growing connection between them, something gnawed at him, a loose thread in his memory, one that tugged harder every day he spent there. It was late one night when Robert stayed in his office long after the employees had left. His desk was littered with old company archives, files that hadn't been touched in years. He had started digging after noticing the plaque in Sarah's shop, Edward Barnes, 1965 to 2021. The name sounded familiar, too familiar. Robert pulled out an old file marked Project Horizon, 2004. He remembered the project vaguely. It was one of their earliest engine prototypes, scrapped after a series of failures. Flipping through the documents, he froze when he saw the name, lead designer Edward Barnes. He frowned. Why hadn't he remembered this sooner? He continued reading, his jaw tightening as the reports painted a different picture than he remembered. Edward Barnes hadn't failed the project. He had warned the company about a flaw in the fuel system design, but management, led by Robert's uncle at the time, had dismissed his concerns to save costs. When the engine prototypes malfunctioned, Edward was blamed. His reputation was destroyed, and he was quietly forced out. Robert leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. All this time, Sarah's father worked for us, and we ruined him. Over the next few days, Robert dove deeper into the archives. He found memos, emails, and letters, evidence of how his uncle had manipulated the narrative to protect the company. Edward Barnes had been a scapegoat. After being fired, he had opened his own garage, working quietly until the day he died. Robert felt a heavy weight settle on his chest. The garage where Sarah poured her soul into engines existed because of a betrayal his family had caused. For the first time in his life, Robert felt ashamed of the Mitchell name. The following day, Robert arrived at the shop, but his usual confident demeanor was gone. Sarah noticed immediately. "You look like you lost a race," she said, wiping her hands. Robert hesitated, unsure how much to say. "Sarah, your father, did he ever work for Mitchell Automotive?" Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, as if a shadow had passed over her face. "Yeah, a long time ago. Why?" Robert swallowed hard. "I found out he worked on Project Horizon." Sarah's jaw tightened. "He did. He loved that project, said it was the best design of his career. Then your company threw him out and ruined his name." Robert winced. "You know about that?" I know enough, Sarah said coldly. I was 16 when he came home with a box of his things. He stopped smiling after that, never talked about it again. He said some things weren't worth fighting anymore. The anger in her voice was like a blade. Robert wanted to explain, to tell her it wasn't her father's fault, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't sure she would believe him. Sarah, he said softly, your father was right. The project failed because the company ignored his warnings. He was set up. He didn't deserve what happened. She stared at him, her expression hard. And now you tell me this? After all these years? I didn't know, Robert admitted. But I do now. And I'm going to make it right. Sarah laughed bitterly. Make it right? You think you can undo what happened to him? He's gone, Mr. Mitchell. My father's gone. Robert stepped closer. I can't bring him back, but I can clear his name. I can make sure everyone knows the truth. Sarah looked away, her voice trembling despite her anger. Words won't change anything. Then I'll do more than talk, Robert said firmly. I owe your father that much. I owe you that much. For the first time since they met, Sarah didn't respond with sarcasm or defiance. Instead, she turned back to the engine and began working. Her movements sharp and quick, like she was trying to push him away through sheer force of focus. Robert stood there, wanting to say more, but knowing it would only make things worse. Finally, he left the shop quietly, the sound of her wrench echoing behind him. As he drove away, he knew things would never be the same. The truth had changed everything. About Sarah, about her father, and about himself. And deep down he knew that earning Sarah's trust again would be harder than fixing any engine. The following days at Barnes & Sons were different. The easy banter between Sarah and Robert had vanished, replaced by a heavy silence. Sarah worked with a new intensity, her movements sharp and mechanical, as though she were trying to drown her emotions in the clatter of tools and the roar of engines. Robert kept showing up, but he sensed the distance. Every time he tried to start a conversation, Sarah gave him short answers, her tone clipped. The warmth in her eyes had cooled, and he could feel the wall she had built around herself. That night, after Robert had left, Sarah sat alone in the shop. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows on the floor. She stared at the framed photo of her father, the man who had taught her everything. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Did you know? Did you know they used you?" Tears pricked at her eyes, but she wiped them away with the back of her hand. She hated crying. Her father had always told her that tears were fine, but fixing the problem was better. Still, the pain was there, sharp and fresh. She remembered the night he came home with that cardboard box. How he had sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands, saying nothing for hours. How he had told her later, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Sometimes the people you trust will choose money over truth." Sarah clenched her fists. Robert's confession had ripped open an old wound she thought had scarred over. She didn't know whether to hate him for being part of the Mitchell legacy, or to believe him when he said he wanted to make it right. Meanwhile, Robert was in his office, surrounded by stacks of files. He hadn't gone home. He barely noticed the hours slipping by. Every document he read confirmed what he already knew. Edward Barnes had been betrayed. He found emails where his uncle had dismissed Edward's warnings, internal memos where they shifted blame, even a draft statement that painted Edward as unreliable. Each piece of evidence felt like a dagger to Robert's conscience. "This ends now," he muttered to himself. The next morning, he called his board of directors into an emergency meeting. They were surprised by the sudden summons, even more so when Robert slammed a thick folder onto the table. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cold, "I've uncovered something you all need to see." For the next hour, Robert presented everything: the evidence, the truth about Project Horizon, and how Edward Barnes had been wrongfully accused. The room fell silent. "This company built its success on a lie," Robert said, looking each board member in the eye. "And I won't allow that to continue. We're going to correct this, publicly." One of the older members scoffed. "Robert, why dig up the past? The man's dead, the damage is done." Robert's glare was icy. "That man's name deserves to be cleared. And if any of you think protecting our image is more important than the truth, you're free to resign." The room fell silent again. No one resigned. Later that day, Robert returned to the garage. Sarah was working on the Mustang engine, her back to him. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. "Sarah," he said softly. She didn't look up. "What do you want?" "I spoke to the board," Robert said. "We're issuing a public statement. The company will officially recognize your father as the true lead engineer of Project Horizon. His name will be restored." Sarah paused, the wrench in her hand frozen mid-turn. Slowly she turned to face him, her eyes filled with both disbelief and suspicion. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Robert said, "and because I owe it to him, and to you." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any hint of deceit. Finally, she shook her head. "You think that'll make up for everything? That a few words on paper will erase what happened?" "No," Robert admitted. "Nothing can erase it. But it's a start." Sarah exhaled slowly, her anger softening just a fraction. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Robert." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I'm asking for a chance to prove I'm not like the man who hurt your father." For the first time in days, Sarah's gaze softened slightly. "We'll see," she said quietly. That evening, Robert stayed to help her with the Mustang. They worked side by side in silence, but it wasn't the cold silence of before. It was something different, heavier, yet somehow warmer. A silence that said maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to understand each other. As the last light of day faded, Sarah tightened the final bolt and stepped back. "It's coming together," she said, almost to herself. Robert looked at the half-assembled engine and nodded. "So are we." Sarah glanced at him, surprised, but she didn't reply. Instead, she handed him a wrench. "Don't drop it this time." Robert smiled. "I won't." And for the first time since the truth came out, Sarah almost smiled back. Robert woke up before dawn, his mind sharper than it had been in years. The decision was made. Mitchell Automotive would no longer be the company that buried its mistakes. It would be the company that faced them and fixed them. He spent the early hours drafting a plan, one that went far beyond clearing Edward Barnes's name. He wanted to change the very culture of his company, to shift it from numbers and profits to passion and innovation. The kind of passion Sarah had shown him. By noon, the boardroom was filled with journalists and flashing cameras. Robert stood at the podium, his expression calm but resolute. Behind him, a screen displayed an old photo of Edward Barnes smiling with an early prototype engine. "Today," Robert began, "Mitchell Automotive acknowledges a mistake made nearly 20 years ago. Edward Barnes, a brilliant engineer and visionary, was wrongfully blamed for the failure of Project Horizon. The truth is, his warnings were ignored, and our company allowed him to take the fall for decisions he did not make." Murmurs rippled through the room. Robert continued, his voice steady. "Edward Barnes was not a failure. He was the heart of that project. Today, we honor his legacy. Effective immediately, Project Horizon will be renamed the Barnes Engine Initiative, dedicated to innovation inspired by his designs." The cameras clicked rapidly. Reporters shouted questions, but Robert raised his hand. "This is not just about setting the record straight. It's about building a future that respects the past, and it's only the beginning." When the conference ended, the news spread like wildfire. Edward Barnes's name was trending across social media, and former employees who had known him began sharing stories of his brilliance. Robert felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but he knew the hardest part wasn't the public. It was Sarah. Sarah was in the garage when Chewy rushed in, his phone in hand. "Sarah, you have to see this." She frowned, wiping her hands, and took the phone. On the screen was a live news broadcast of Robert's announcement. She watched in silence, her chest tightening as she heard him speak her father's name with respect, as he called him a visionary. When the broadcast ended, Sarah stood there, stunned. Chewy looked up at her, his eyes wide. "He did it. He really did it." Sarah exhaled shakily. "Yeah, he did." For the first time in years, she felt a spark of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. That evening, Robert drove to the shop. Sarah was waiting outside, arms crossed, her face unreadable. He stepped out of the car, unsure what to expect. "You made quite a speech," she said. "It wasn't a speech," Robert replied. "It was the truth." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "My father would have liked to hear those words." "I wish I could have said them to him," Robert admitted. "But I hope saying them to you is a start." Sarah's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't drop her guard entirely. "You're changing things at the company?" "From the ground up," he said. "No more lies, no more shortcuts. I want engines that sing, not just machines that sell." For the first time, Sarah smiled faintly. "Sounds like you've been listening." Robert chuckled. "I have. To engines. And to you." Inside the shop, the Mustang engine gleamed under the lights, nearly complete. Sarah gestured to it. "Tomorrow, we finish it." Robert nodded. "And after that?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "After that, you go back to running your empire, and I keep fixing engines with soul." "Maybe," Robert said, smiling. "Or maybe we build something together." Sarah gave him a long look, as if weighing his sincerity. "We'll see, Mr. Mitchell." Just as Robert was leaving, Sarah spoke up again. "Robert," he turned. "What is it?" Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "If you're serious about this change, about everything, you'll have to prove it. Not to the press, not to your board, to me." Robert met her eyes. "Then I'll prove it, one bolt at a time." Sarah smirked. "Good, because engines don't forgive liars, and neither do I." As he drove away, Robert felt something stronger than hope: determination. This wasn't just about fixing a company or clearing a name. It was about building trust, piece by piece, until Sarah Barnes believed in him. The next morning, Robert arrived at the shop with an unusual heaviness in his chest. He was used to challenges: business deals, negotiations, power plays. But what awaited him with Sarah Barnes was different. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about being worthy of something that couldn't be bought. Sarah was waiting for him, arms crossed, leaning against the Mustang's hood. Her expression wasn't angry, but it wasn't welcoming either. "You're early," she said. "So are you," Robert replied, forcing a small smile. Sarah straightened, walking toward him slowly. "Robert, before we finish this engine, there's something you need to hear, and you're not going to like it." She pulled out a folded piece of paper from her back pocket and handed it to him. It was yellowed, creased from years of being read, and refolded. "What is this?" Robert asked. "Read it." Robert unfolded the paper carefully. It was a letter written in neat handwriting, Edward Barnes's handwriting. "To Sarah, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, or maybe just too tired to keep fighting. I want you to know the truth about why I left Mitchell Automotive. I tried to protect what I built, but they destroyed my name. They called me a failure, a liability. But the truth is, I warned them. They didn't listen. And when I stood my ground, they crushed me to protect their bottom line. Promise me, Sarah, that you'll never let anyone treat you the way they treated me. Promise me you'll fight for engines, for stories, for the soul of the work, not for money, not for power, for what's right. Love, Dad." Robert's throat tightened as he finished reading. "He knew," Robert whispered. "He knew they betrayed him." Sarah's voice was steady, but her eyes burned. "He died believing the Mitchells destroyed him, and he was right." Robert met her gaze. "I'm not my uncle. I won't run from this." Sarah stepped closer, her voice sharp. "Then why did it take you so long to find out? Why did it take me showing you how to listen for you to care?" Robert swallowed hard. "Because I was blind. I was so focused on success, I didn't see the people who built it. I didn't see what mattered, but I see it now, Sarah. I see you." The tension hung thick in the air, but Sarah didn't back away. She turned to the Mustang engine and said, "Prove it, not with words, with this." Robert nodded, stepping to the workbench. For the next few hours, they worked side by side, tightening bolts, aligning parts, and cleaning every component. Neither spoke much, but the silence wasn't cold. It was heavy with unspoken thoughts. At one point, Sarah handed him a wrench and said softly, "This was my dad's favorite tool. Don't drop it." Robert gripped it firmly. "I won't." When the last bolt was in place, Sarah stepped back and gestured to the ignition. "Start it." Robert hesitated, then turned the key. The engine roared to life, not just running, but singing. The sound filled the shop, deep and strong, like a heartbeat coming alive after years of silence. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if hearing her father's voice in the roar. When she opened them, there was a glimmer of something softer. As the engine idled, Robert turned to her. "Sarah, I meant what I said. I'll keep proving it, every day, until you believe me." Sarah met his gaze. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The world seemed to narrow to just the two of them and the engine's song. Robert took a small step closer, his breath mingling with hers. For a moment, it seemed they would close the gap. But Sarah turned away, breaking the spell. "Don't rush it, Robert. Trust is built, not forced." Robert nodded, though his heart ached. "I'll wait." When the Mustang engine purred to a stop, Sarah looked at him with something almost like respect. "You're learning." Robert smiled faintly. "I have a good teacher." Sarah grabbed a rag and tossed it to him. "Clean up, you look like hell." He laughed, wiping the grease from his hands. "Yeah, but it's the best I've felt in years." As the sun set behind them, the Mustang gleamed, reborn. And so, in its own way, was Robert Mitchell. For a brief moment, things seemed to be moving in the right direction. The Mustang was running beautifully. Robert was slowly earning Sarah's guarded respect, and Mitchell Automotive was finally shedding its old ways. But change is never without resistance. And for Robert, the storm came sooner than expected. 2 days later, Robert entered the boardroom to find tension simmering. The directors sat with stiff postures, papers spread out in front of them. His uncle, Harold Mitchell, sat at the head of the table with a smirk that Robert hadn't seen in years. "You've caused quite a stir," Harold said smoothly. "Restoring Barnes's name, changing policies, cutting profits to focus on passion. The investors are not happy." Robert leaned forward. "We're not losing money. We're rebuilding trust." Harold's smirk deepened. "Trust doesn't pay dividends, Robert. Profits do. And your obsession with this mechanic and her sob story is making the board nervous." Robert's jaw tightened. "This isn't about a mechanic. It's about doing what's right." Harold pushed a document toward him. "Either you drop this nonsense, or we'll hold a vote to remove you as CEO." Robert stared at the paper, his blood boiling. "You'd rather keep a lie alive than face the truth?" Harold shrugged. "Business is about perception. Don't let your emotions get in the way." Robert stood, his voice low and dangerous. "If you think I'll back down, you don't know me at all." That evening, Robert drove to the garage, needing to see Sarah more than ever. But when he arrived, she wasn't her usual calm self. She stood outside, holding her phone, her face pale with anger. "Sarah?" he asked cautiously. She turned to him, eyes blazing. "Did you send the press to my shop?" Robert blinked. "What? No." "They were here today," Sarah snapped. "Reporters, cameras, questions about me and you. They said you leaked the story to make yourself look good." Robert felt the anger rising in him. "That's not true. I would never." "Wouldn't you?" Sarah cut in, her voice shaking. "Because it sure looks like you're using me and my father's name to clean up your company's image." Robert took a step closer, desperate. "Sarah, listen to me. This wasn't me. This was my uncle. He's trying to turn you against me." "How convenient," she said bitterly. "You expect me to believe that?" Robert's heart ached at the coldness in her voice. "Yes, because it's the truth. You told me to prove myself, and I am. Don't let him destroy that." Sarah looked away, her hands trembling. "I don't know what to believe right now." Robert stayed for hours, trying to explain, but Sarah barely spoke. She worked on the Mustang silently, her back to him, as if shutting him out. Finally, he left, feeling more defeated than he had in years. As he drove home, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Walk away, Robert, or you'll lose everything." The message was followed by a photo. Sarah standing in her shop, unaware, taken from a distance. Robert's grip tightened on the steering wheel. This wasn't just about the company anymore. Someone was threatening Sarah. Meanwhile, Sarah sat alone in the garage, staring at her father's photo. "Dad," she whispered, "am I making a mistake? Am I letting another Mitchell hurt me?" She wanted to believe Robert. She wanted to believe he was different. But the shadow of her father's betrayal loomed large, and trust was a fragile thing. Late that night, Robert stood on his balcony, the city lights below him. He held the threatening message on his phone, his jaw clenched. "They think they can scare me," he muttered. "They think they can use her." He turned toward the horizon, where the first light of dawn was creeping in. "They're wrong." Robert knew what he had to do. He wouldn't just clear Edward Barnes's name. He would tear down the rot in his company, no matter the cost. And he would protect Sarah, because she deserved better than the legacy his uncle had left behind. The next morning, Robert arrived at the garage earlier than ever. He had barely slept, but his mind was clear. If he wanted to protect Sarah and prove himself, it would take more than speeches and promises. Sarah was already there, crouched by the Mustang, tightening a final set of bolts. She didn't look up when he entered. "You're persistent," she said flatly. "I'm not leaving," Robert replied. Instead of arguing, Robert grabbed a pair of gloves and knelt beside her. "What needs to be done?" Sarah gave him a wary look. "You're not here to talk?" "No," Robert said. "I'm here to work." For the next several hours, they worked side by side. Sarah handed him parts without explanation, forcing him to rely on what he had learned. He fumbled at first, but gradually his hands began to remember. The torque, the balance, the rhythm of tightening bolts, just enough. At one point, Sarah watched him closely as he fitted a gasket. "Not bad," she said reluctantly. "You're learning." Robert allowed himself a small smile. "I have a good teacher." "Don't flatter me," Sarah said, but the corner of her mouth twitched. When the Mustang engine was finally complete, Sarah wiped her hands and crossed her arms. "All right, Mr. Mitchell, moment of truth. Start it." Robert hesitated, then turned the key. The engine roared to life, smooth and powerful, the deep growl filling the garage. He grinned like a kid, feeling the vibration through his hands. Sarah nodded approvingly. "Not bad for a suit." Robert laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the engine purred, Robert turned to her, his expression serious. "Sarah, I didn't leak that story. My uncle is behind it. He's trying to destroy everything I'm building." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "And why should I believe you?" "Because I'm still here," Robert said softly, even when it would be easier to walk away. For the first time in days, Sarah's guarded expression softened slightly. "You really want to prove yourself?" "Yes," Robert said firmly. "Then you'll do it here," Sarah said. "Not in your boardroom. Here, every day, until I know you're not like the rest of them." Robert didn't hesitate. "I'll be here, one bolt at a time." While they worked, neither of them noticed a black sedan parked across the street. Inside, a man in a suit snapped photos of the garage and the two of them working together. He sent the images to Harold Mitchell with a single message. "He's not giving up. What's the next move?" That evening, as Robert prepared to leave, an unfamiliar car pulled into the shop's lot. A man stepped out, dressed in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase. Sarah frowned. "Who's this?" The man approached with a slick smile. "Miss Barnes, I represent Mitchell Automotive's board. We'd like to offer you a settlement, cash, enough to close this shop and walk away. No more headlines, no more drama." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "You think you can buy me?" "It's a generous offer," the man said smoothly. "Take it, and you won't have to deal with the trouble that's coming." Robert stepped between them, his voice cold. "Get off this property, now." The man smirked. "You're making a mistake, Robert." Robert stepped closer, his tone lethal. "No, the mistake was threatening her." The man left without another word, but his smile lingered as he drove away. After the car disappeared, Sarah turned to Robert. "He's with your uncle?" "Yes," Robert said. "And this won't be the last time he tries something." Sarah looked down, her hands trembling slightly. "They'll destroy you for this." "Let them try," Robert said, his voice steady. "I'm not backing down. Not on this. Not on you." For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to believe him, just a little. As night settled over the garage, the Mustang sat finished, gleaming under the lights. Sarah rested her hand on the hood, feeling the warmth of the newly running engine. "You fixed this one," she said quietly, "but the real work's still ahead." Robert nodded. "I know, and I'm ready." The following morning, Robert stood in front of the towering glass facade of Mitchell Automotive. For years, this building had been his fortress, his place of power. Now, it felt more like enemy territory. Inside were people who would rather protect their lies than face the truth. But today, Robert wasn't walking in as a CEO who signed papers. Today, he was walking in as a man ready to fight. He gathered the employees in the main assembly hall, something he hadn't done in years. Mechanics, engineers, office staff. They all stood watching as Robert took the stage. "I know the last few weeks have been turbulent," he began, his voice firm. "You've seen the headlines. You've heard the whispers. But here's the truth. Mitchell Automotive has been living in the shadow of past mistakes. We buried the name of a man who gave everything to this company, Edward Barnes, and I will not let that stand." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Robert continued, his tone rising with conviction. "We are not just here to build machines. We're here to build engines with soul, to innovate, to care about every part we touch. If you're here only for the paycheck, walk out now. But if you're here because you love what we do, then stand with me." The room fell silent. Then, slowly, one mechanic clapped, another joined. Soon, the hall echoed with applause. Robert felt something shift. Small, but real. Change had begun. That evening, Robert returned to Barnes & Sons. Sarah was waiting, arms crossed, but there was no anger in her eyes this time. Only curiosity. "You had a big speech today," she said. "Chewy showed me the live stream." Robert smirked. "Did I pass your test?" Sarah tilted her head. "Maybe, but speeches are easy. Show me you mean it." "I intend to," Robert replied. "That's why I brought this." He opened the back of his car, revealing a battered old carburetor from one of the company's abandoned prototypes. "This is from a model my uncle deemed a failure. I want to rebuild it, with you." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're ready to get your hands this dirty?" Robert grinned. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." For hours, they worked side by side under the dim lights of the garage. Sarah guided him through every step, correcting his mistakes with sharp but patient words. Slowly, Robert began to understand the rhythm of the work, not as a CEO, but as a mechanic. At one point, Sarah asked quietly, "Why are you really doing this? You have everything, money, power. Why risk it?" Robert paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Because having everything means nothing if it's built on lies. I don't just want to fix engines anymore. I want to fix what my family broke." Sarah looked at him, and for the first time, there was no wall in her eyes, just a glimmer of something almost tender. As midnight approached, the carburetor was finally restored. Sarah tested it, nodding in approval. "Not bad, Mr. Mitchell. Maybe you're not hopeless after all." Robert chuckled. "I'll take that as a compliment." Sarah stepped closer, her voice softer now. "My father would have liked you. Not the CEO version, the one standing here covered in grease." Robert met her gaze, his chest tightening. "I wish I could have met him." "You're starting to," Sarah said, pointing to the engine they had just rebuilt. "Every time you do this, you understand a little more." They stood there for a moment, closer than ever before. The distance between them seemed to shrink with every heartbeat. But before the moment could turn into something more, Sarah stepped back. "Don't think this means you're forgiven," she said, though her voice lacked its usual edge. Robert smiled faintly. "I'll keep earning it, one bolt at a time." As Robert left the shop, he spotted the same black sedan parked a few blocks away. The man inside was on the phone, watching him. Robert narrowed his eyes. The battle with his uncle wasn't over. The sabotage, the threats, it was all building toward something bigger. But now, Robert wasn't fighting alone. He had Sarah's belief, fragile, but growing, and he wasn't about to lose it. The following weekend, Sarah surprised Robert with an unexpected request. "Bring work clothes," she told him over the phone. "Ones you don't mind destroying." Robert had laughed at first, thinking it was another of her mechanic lessons. But when he arrived at the garage, he realized she wasn't talking about engines. Buckets of paint, brushes, and rollers were scattered across the floor. The old Barnes & Sons auto repair sign had been taken down and leaned against the wall, its faded letters barely visible. Chewy was already there, holding a paintbrush twice the size of his hand. His face lit up with excitement. "What's going on?" Robert asked. Sarah wiped her hands on a rag and nodded toward the blank wooden board they had set up. "We're giving this place a new face. Fresh paint, fresh start. If we're going to keep fighting, the shop needs to look alive again." Robert smiled. "I like it. What's the new name going to be?" Sarah glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Barnes Auto Works. My dad built this place, and his name stays. Always." Robert nodded with respect, as it should. The three of them spent the entire day working. Sarah rolled the base coat while Robert climbed the ladder to paint the edges. Chewy enthusiastically splashed paint on anything that stood still long enough, including Robert's jeans. "Hey!" Robert laughed as a streak of blue dripped down his leg. "You missed a spot," Chewy said, grinning mischievously. Sarah smirked. "Looks good on you, Mr. Mitchell. Maybe you should trade your suits for overalls." "Don't tempt me," Robert replied, continuing to paint. By late afternoon, the sign was complete. Barnes Auto Works painted in bold white letters over a deep navy background. The garage itself had a fresh coat, too, the old worn walls now bright and clean. Sarah stood back, hands on her hips, and smiled. A rare, genuine smile. "He'd have liked this," she said softly, her voice almost lost to the breeze. Robert stepped beside her. "He'd be proud of you, Sarah. More than proud." For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she looked at him, her eyes softer than he had ever seen. "Thanks, Robert." That evening, they ordered pizza and sat on the hood of the Mustang, eating under the fading light. Chewy told stories about school, making them laugh, while Sarah occasionally glanced at Robert when she thought he wasn't looking. At one point she asked, "Why do you keep coming back here? You have a company to run." Robert leaned back, gazing at the stars beginning to emerge. "Because this place reminds me why I started, why I loved engines in the first place. I lost that somewhere along the way." Sarah tilted her head. "And you think you found it here?" "I know I have," Robert said, his voice steady, "and I'm not letting it go again." For a long moment, neither spoke, but something unspoken passed between them, something fragile and new. As they finished eating, Robert's phone buzzed. It was an anonymous message. "You've made your choice. The board votes in 3 days. Prepare to lose everything." Robert stared at the screen, jaw tight. Sarah noticed his expression. "Bad news?" He slipped the phone back into his pocket, forcing a calm tone. "Nothing I can't handle." But inside, he knew the final confrontation with his uncle was approaching, and it would decide everything. Not just his company, but whether he could keep his promise to Sarah. Before leaving, Sarah handed Robert a small paintbrush dipped in white. "Sign your name," she said, pointing to a corner of the new sign. Robert raised an eyebrow. "You sure? I thought this place was yours." "It is," Sarah said, with a faint smile. "But you've earned a corner, for now." Robert chuckled and carefully wrote RM in small letters near the edge. When he stepped back, Sarah nodded approvingly. "Not bad, Mr. Mitchell. Not bad at all." That night, Robert drove away with paint still on his hands, but his heart felt lighter. For the first time, he felt like he was building something real, not just for himself, but for Sarah, and the memory of her father. The shop stood behind him, glowing under the streetlight, a symbol of everything worth fighting for. In the days following the repainting, Robert became a fixture at Barnes Auto Works. He was no longer the billionaire who dropped in for show. He was part of the shop, working alongside Sarah and Chewy, getting his hands as dirty as anyone else's. Sarah still kept her guard up, but every shared smile, every moment of silent understanding chipped away at the walls between them. One night, after Chewy had gone home, Sarah and Robert stayed late to finish tuning the Mustang. The shop was quiet except for the hum of the radio and the clink of tools. When they finally fired up the engine and it purred perfectly, Sarah let out a laugh, a sound Robert realized he had grown to love. "You're smiling," he said. "You're seeing things," she replied. But she didn't stop smiling. The tension between them was electric, unspoken, yet undeniable. When Robert stepped closer, Sarah didn't move away. Their eyes met, and for a moment, it felt inevitable. His hand brushed hers, and she didn't pull back. "Sarah," he began, his voice low. "Don't say anything," she whispered. And then, finally, they kissed. Not a desperate kiss, but a slow, deep one, filled with everything they hadn't said. When they pulled apart, Sarah looked at him seriously. "This doesn't mean I trust you completely," she said. "I know," Robert replied with a soft smile. "But it's a start." While things between Robert and Sarah deepened, the battle at Mitchell Automotive intensified. Harold Mitchell rallied the board against Robert, accusing him of reckless decisions and emotional weakness. The vote to remove him as CEO was set. Robert spent his days at the shop and his nights preparing for war. Sarah noticed the exhaustion in his eyes, but said nothing. She knew he had to fight his own battle. The day of the vote, Robert walked into the boardroom with evidence of Harold's sabotage, emails, financial manipulations, and the threats sent to Sarah. When Harold tried to speak, Robert slammed the evidence onto the table. "You betrayed this company," Robert said coldly. "You betrayed its people, and you tried to destroy someone I care about." The board voted. Harold was removed, escorted out in silence. Robert retained his position as CEO, but this time it wasn't about power. It was about integrity. With Harold gone, Robert began transforming the company. He implemented programs to honor innovation and craftsmanship, naming the new design lab the Edward Barnes Center for Engine Excellence. Sarah was invited to consult on projects, and though she declined a full-time role, she agreed to work closely on special designs. The garage thrived. Customers flocked to Barnes Auto Works, drawn by its reputation for engines with soul. Sarah expanded the shop, but she refused to lose the personal touch her father had built. One afternoon, she found Robert sitting on the hood of the Mustang, sketching ideas for a new engine. She sat beside him, and they worked on the design together until sunset. For the first time, she saw not a CEO, but a man who truly listened. Months later, the Barnes Engine Initiative unveiled its first model at a public event. Reporters crowded around as Robert took the stage. But this time, Sarah stood beside him. "This engine," Robert announced, "is built not just with technology, but with heart." Inspired by the late Edward Barnes and guided by his daughter Sarah, it represents what happens when passion meets precision. When the engine roared to life, the crowd erupted in applause. Sarah looked at Robert, and for the first time, she felt pride, not just for the engine, but for what they had built together. After the event, Robert returned to the garage with Sarah. They worked together on the Mustang one last time, not because it needed fixing, but because it had become their ritual. As the engine sang beneath their hands, Sarah finally spoke the words Robert had been waiting for. "I trust you," she said softly. Robert turned to her, smiling, "And I'll never stop earning that." They kissed again, this time with no hesitation. Life settled into a new rhythm. Robert continued running Mitchell Automotive with integrity, often visiting the shop to stay grounded. Sarah kept Barnes Auto Works thriving, with Chewy becoming her star apprentice. On quiet nights, the three of them would sit outside the shop, watching the stars and listening to the hum of the Mustang's engine. The scars of the past were still there, but they had healed into something stronger. Robert had learned to listen, not just to engines, but to people. Sarah had learned that not all Mitchells were the same, and together they built something greater than either could have alone. As the sun rose over Brentwood, the Chevelle and Mustang stood side by side, engines purring like a promise. The road ahead was long, but they were ready to drive it, together. Years later, Barnes Auto Works had become legendary. Mechanics came from all over to learn Sarah's philosophy of engines with soul. Chewy grew into a talented engineer, designing his own models under Sarah's mentorship. At Mitchell Automotive, The Edward Barnes Center stood as a testament to truth and innovation. Robert remained CEO, but more importantly, he remained Sarah's partner in life and work. On the anniversary of Edward Barnes's passing, Sarah and Robert stood before the plaque honoring him. The engines in the shop hummed softly, like a chorus of voices carrying his legacy forward. Sarah placed her hand on Robert's and smiled. He'd be proud. Robert kissed her forehead. So am I. And with that, they walked back into the garage, ready to keep building, one bolt, one story, one soul at a time.